Turn your face into the east wind, and if you could see forever, you would see Ivan's land. It is a land where summer is short and pale like a celandine, winter long and cold as an icicle. Ivan does not live there anymore, for he grew old long ago and is gone. But the people of the pine woods remember him. They remember him all the time, but most of all they remember him in winter, because they are not afraid of winter anymore. They have no need to be afraid, because of something Ivan did when he was very small. Ivan and his brother lived in the house of their father, the blacksmith, in a village in the shadow of the great dark forest. The people of the village were poor, but in the summertime they were mostly happy, so that the pale, warm air rang with their laughter and their singing as they worked. But as the short summers gave way to autumn, their songs became sad songs, and their laughter thin, for they knew that far away to the north, Starjik was greasing the runners of his sled and rounding up his wolves. Starjik. Whisper his name, and it was winter in your heart. When Starjik was in a village, the people lay very still behind their shutters, but always in the morning, a child was gone. For Starjik was known in every Pine Woods village as the child taker, and those he took were never seen again. One night, Starjik came to Ivan's house, and when Ivan awoke in the morning, his little brother was gone. All the village wept for the blacksmith and his wife, and for little Ivan, who must now play alone. And Ivan walked in Starjik's sled tracks to the end of the village, and stood there a long time, gazing into the north. For a long time that night he sat listening to the wind outside, and as he listened it seemed to Ivan that something was crying out there in the night. "Wait, little brother, I will not leave you. I am coming." He blew out his candle and climbed into bed without taking off his clothes. After a while, the door of his room was opened quietly, and Ivan pretended to be sleeping, while his mother smoothed his quilt and went out. Ivan slipped out of bed and pulled on his boots. Then he took his fur parka and moved quietly to the door. Moments later, he was across the warm, dark kitchen and out into the freezing wind. Next morning, the people were awakened by a terrible cry from the blacksmith's house. The blacksmith's wife had crept early into Ivan's room and found his bed empty. All that day, the people stood about the village in groups, talking. But nobody had heard Starjik come again, and nobody could remember having known anyone as unlucky as the blacksmith and his wife. Far away through the forest and over the hills walked Ivan. He was afraid, more afraid than he had ever been, for nobody had ever seen Starjik's land and lived to return home. His head was bowed, and he cried a little as he went along, and his tears became pips of ice before they touched the snow. He was afraid, and sometimes he almost turned around to follow his footprints back to his father's house. But then he would see in his mind a picture of his brother, holding out his arms and crying, in a place that was cold beyond imagining. And then Ivan would brush away his tears and go on. On and on he went, and when it began to grow dark, he found a snowdrift, and tunneled into it, as his father had taught him. When morning came, he dug himself out, ate a little food from his pocket, turned his face into the wind, and walked on. The snow was deeper now, and Ivan's feet sank far beneath its surface with every step. He began to feel tired, and to wonder if he would ever see his home again, when there came a sound that felt like an icicle in his heart. It was the long, thin cry a hungry wolf makes when it scents its prey. The cry was answered by another, and soon the pine wood echoed with the howls of the hunting pack. Ivan tried to go faster, but the snow sucked at his boots, making him stumble. He looked back, sobbing. He knew the wolves were running in his tracks with their noses down to smell him out. A tree. He must find a tree to climb. Wolves can outrun any living thing, but they cannot climb trees. He stumbled on, looking wildly around him. But the trees just here were all pines with smooth, icy trunks. The wolf cries drew nearer. He plunged forward, gasping. A few seconds more and they would be upon him. He glanced all about and ploughed through the snow, the wolves at his heels. He leapt. His hands closed around the lowest branch and he swung his legs clear of the group as the first wolf lunged in a flurry of snow. Now and then a wolf would leap, its jaws snapping within inches of his feet. Soon Ivan began to feel cold. He knew the frost would be in his fingers. It would spread through his hands until they could no longer grip, and he would fall into that whirling mass of fur and fangs. He clung desperately to his perch. The cold began to seep through his hands. He cried softly, and his tears froze on his cheeks. "Farewell, little brother," he whispered. "I can never save you now." A startled yelp roused him. He shook his head and looked down. The wolves were scattering in all directions, and in their midst, rearing on its hind legs, was a huge bear. Its terrible claws hissed through the air, and the wolves fell back, snapping. The bear lunged at them, and they turned tail, slipping away between the frozen trees. Ivan cried out joyfully, then gasped with horror. Bears kill people, and bears can climb. He pulled up his feet, trying to move higher. The bear dropped onto all its 4 feet and stood a moment, snarling into the forest. Then, with only an upward glance at the boy, it loped off, melting soon among the shadows of the pines. Stiffly, Ivan climbed down. He peered fearfully all around, but the wolves were gone, and there was no sign of the bear. All the day, little Ivan walked on, and when it began to grow dark, he found another snowdrift and made a cave inside it. He ate a little of the bread and snuggled down to sleep. At midnight, Ivan awoke, and it seemed to him that he had heard a voice. He listened. Outside, the wind was howling. After a moment, he closed his eyes again. "It must have been the wind," he said to himself. "Only the wind." But no sooner had he closed his eyes than he seemed to hear the voice again. He got up, knelt by the hole, and stuck his head out. The cold made him gasp. Ivan screwed up his eyes and peered into the darkness. There was nothing. Then, just as he was about to draw his head back inside, he thought he saw a movement under the trees. A small figure, flitting across a paler patch between the shadows. Ivan cried out. The figure. It seemed impossible. But from here it had looked like... "Little brother!" he cried. "Wait!" He was stumbling through deep snow. As he drew near, the small figure seemed to move back, so that he was always the same distance away from it. "Wait!" Ivan cried again. "Oh, don't run away! It's Ivan! Come to take you home!" But the figure was only a smudge now, and as he watched, it faded and was gone. Then he knew that the figure in the trees had been Stargic's cruel trick, and the laughter in the wind Stargic's laughter. But when he looked around, he could not tell which way he had come. He ran, first this way, then that. He was lost, and was about to sink down on the snow when he heard a shrill scream. He jerked his head round and saw a white shape that flew soundlessly between the trees. The owl circled his head on velvet wings and made off through the forest. After a moment it came back and flew round his head again. Perhaps, thought Ivan, it wants me to follow it. When the great white bird flew away again, Ivan followed. In a few moments he saw the snowdrift in which he had made his shelter. He fell to his knees by the entrance and crawled inside with the last of his strength. The snowy owl circled the snowdrift once and was gone. When dawn came, Ivan wrapped himself up in his warm clothing and set out again. There was only a little bread left now in his pocket, and he knew that he must save it, for he still had far to go. When at last it began to grow dark again, Ivan fell to his knees and began to scrape out a tunnel with his mittened hands. After a moment he stopped, his head tilted to one side. From far away, carried on the wind, he thought he heard music. He heard it again. It was the sound of a fiddle. No, it was not real. It would not be real. It was another cruel trick to hurt him, to keep him from doing what he must do. He began once more to scrape at the snow, whistling a little between his teeth to blot out the sound of the fiddle. But when he stopped, there it was, rising and falling in the wind. He got to his feet and gazed towards the sound, biting his lip. There was a faint glow in the sky beyond the pines, and now he was sure there were voices too, mixed in with the fiddle. He looked down at his unfinished den, then out again towards the glow. He saw a picture in his mind of people, happy people who laughed and shouted and danced to the fiddle, and suddenly he was overcome with loneliness. He left the snowdrift and began hurrying through the trees, his eyes fixed on that warm, hypnotic glow. He came out of the trees onto a long slope, and there below him lay a village. Everyone in the village seemed to be out of doors, and when Ivan looked down the street, he could see why. At the far end of it, someone had built an enormous fire. And the music! It wafted in great clouds up the slope, and Ivan had never heard such music. He was weary, but he wanted to dance. And up towards him, their laughter spangling the night, came children, a long ribbon of children, hand in hand, running up the hill. When they drew near, they stopped, and their leader smiled, holding out his hand to Ivan. "Come," he said, "tonight is a feast, and you are welcome here." In the village below, the fiddles began a fresh tune, and stepping forward, Ivan slipped off a mitten and gave his hand. At once they went whirling away across the slope and down to where the people danced through pools of lamplight on the snow. Ivan, skipping, threw back his head and laughed. The music grew louder, and coming round the corner of a house, Ivan saw that they were close to the great fire. In the flames, an ox was roasting, and nearby, on upturned barrels, sat the fiddlers. The line of children circled, forming a ring with the fiddlers in the middle. Round and round they whirled, the firelight dancing in their eyes. Then the circle broke, and the child who had led them was thrust into the center among the fiddlers. And the tune changed, and she danced a special dance for them, while they went round and round. When her dance was finished, the girl rejoined the circle. The next child was pushed forward, and the tune changed again. Ivan watched through tears of joy. The cold was gone, and the loneliness. What would be the tune when his turn came? And what steps would he dance? Black of night, Starjik came to Ivan's village and stole his little brother. Alone and afraid, Ivan followed Starjik's tracks into the frozen waste. He heard music, and feeling cold and lonely, he followed it to find a happy village where the children danced and urged him to join them. They whirled on. Ivan gasped as a volley of wind whipped about his legs, unimaginably cold. In an instant he was blinded as the stinging powder lashed his eyes. He tore his hands from those of his friends and fell to the ground, clawing at his face. He had broken the circle. He must get up and take his place, or the dance would be spoiled. Already the fiddlers had stopped playing. He scrambled to his knees and cried out in pain and disbelief. The fire was gone. There was no ring of children, nor any mark upon the snow where they had been. There were no villagers. The houses lay cold and broken along the empty street. Ivan stood there, forlorn. The wind blew round him, and there was laughter in it, and he knew. He turned and ran along the silent street that had no footprints on it but his own. He did not stop until he topped the slope, found a snowdrift, and burrowed into it. He cried softly till sleep came. The next morning he set out, weary and sad. Ivan had not walked far when, turning to look back, he saw something moving far away between the snow-laden trees. At first it looked like a whirl of snow crystals, whipped by the wind. But as it came closer, he saw that it was an old woman in a grey, sparkling shawl, which flapped about her as she came towards him. She was gazing at Ivan, but she was also smiling. Ivan took off his mitten, put his hand into his pocket, and pulled out a crust of bread. He held it out to her. "Old woman," he said, "it is cold. Share my bread. It will warm you a little, perhaps." "You are kind, but I do not need your bread," said the old woman. "You are a good boy to care about an old woman like me." "But I am not an old woman always. Sometimes I am an icicle or a bear. Sometimes I am a twist of wind-blown snow, colder than the night. One night," she said, "I was a snowy owl." Ivan stared, remembering how he had been lost and freezing in the night. "Were you the owl who showed me the way, and the bear who drove off the wolves?" The old woman smiled. It may well be so, for lovers find small miracles, no matter what men say, and no one ever loved better than you love your brother. How do you know of this? Cried Ivan. The old woman held out her hand to him. Pips of ice lay like diamonds in her palm. These are the tears that you cried for your brother, she said. I have followed you, gathering them from the snow, because you will need them soon. Ivan frowned. What would I do with tears, he said. Why will I need them soon? To soften Starjik's heart, replied the old woman. Here, take them. Ivan gazed at them. I do not understand, he said. What am I to do with these tears? The old woman became grave. At the moment of your greatest danger, she said, you must fling the tears into Starjik's face and say, brothers nevermore shall part, melt the winter in his heart. Ivan said the words softly to himself, so that he would remember, and the old woman nodded. That is right, she said, and now go, for I can help you no more. Ivan turned and walked on, and after a long time, he came to a mountain. At the foot of the mountain was a high cave with the wind booming in its mouth. Ivan shuddered, because he knew that he had come at last to Starjik's land. Inside the cave it was utterly black. The roar of the wind was deafening, and it was deadly cold. Somewhere in this terrible place, Ivan's little brother was waiting for Ivan to come and take him home. He set his lips in a thin, firm line and moved on into the blackness. Something fluttered in his face. He struck at it with his hand. Whatever the things were, they were all around him. He screamed, but the wind drowned the cry. For a long time, Ivan moved onward through the cold darkness. Presently he stopped, listening intently. Somewhere in front of him, he heard a laugh. As he moved on, the laughter grew louder, and he could hear other sounds too, a swishing noise, and, now and then, a thin, high scream. Soon he was looking into a great glittering cavern. The floor was blue ice, and enormous icicles hung in thousands from the roof. In the center of the cavern, its back towards the boy, stood a hideous figure. It was stooped and crooked, and its white robe hung in folds from a bony frame. In one hand it gripped a thin, springy rod, of the kind which Ivan's people used to fish for trout in the river. The creature was fishing, but not in the water, and not for fish. He was fishing in the air, and his victim was a tiny bat that whirled and tugged frantically as the man began to wind in the thin line. When the terrified creature was close enough, the man clawed it out of the air, crushed it, and dropped it onto the ice, where the broken bodies of several others lay. Then he threw back his head and laughed horribly. Ivan drew back into the passage. The man's cruelty had sickened him, and the laughter turned his blood cold. No other man could possibly behave with such cruelty. The man was Starjik, and Ivan knew that if he fell into those awful hands, he need expect no more mercy than the poor, broken bat. And somewhere not far away, this creature had his brother. The thought of his little brother in the hands of such a man filled Ivan with rage. He clenched his fists and stepped into the open. Instantly, he froze. It was as though his arms and legs had become ice. Try as he might, he could not move. Starjik no longer fished. He sat now in the middle of the cavern on a throne of age-grey wood, and his icy stare held Ivan rigid. The pale eyes now seemed to draw Ivan across the icy floor until he stood trembling before the throne. Starjik stared down at him, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. His grey beard was still with ice, and his hair fell in frozen strands about his thin shoulders. After a long time he spoke, and his voice was like walking on crisp snow. "Who are you?" Ivan hoped that Starjik could not see him trembling. "I am Ivan," he said. "The blacksmith is my father." Starjik's lips twitched cruelly. "Why do you come here?" he hissed. "Do you not know that all who enter Starjik's land are dead?" "I've come for my brother," said Ivan. "Your brother is dead," said Starjik. "No, he's not dead. I can feel him." "That is not possible. People cannot feel other people. They can only see them or hear them. Do you see your brother here? Do you hear him? No, said Ivan, but he is nearby. Stargic gripped the arm of his throne and rose to his feet. Very well, he said softly. You are right, little Ivan. Your brother is close by. He turned, beckoning. Come, and I will show you. To one side of the cavern, an ice curtain hung from roof to floor. Stargic went behind this curtain, and Ivan was close on his heels. Ivan clapped a hand to his mouth, stifling a cry. He was looking at a great block of ice. It was higher than 3 houses, and as long as the cavern. The ice was as clear as a crystal pool, and inside he saw children. Many children, trapped in the solid ice. Some looked as though they had been running, others seemed to have been skipping. Some sat and some stood. There were frozen smiles and frozen frowns. And there, right at the front, gazing out from his icy prison, was Ivan's brother. Stargic laughed cruelly. Such pretty children, he said, and mine forever. Ivan looked into the twisted face, and his eyes were filled with tears. But these children do not move, he cried. You cannot play with them or hear them laugh. I take the children to punish those who sent me away. Once I was a child like these, but the other children would not play with me. They said my heart was cold, and they sent me away. Now I have friends, and every one a pretty one, for I have chosen them myself. He turned, smiling coldly down at Ivan. You also are a pretty child, he hissed. You would not be out of place in my collection. You cannot escape. I have only to touch you and you are mine forever. Ivan felt the ice prison at his back. He could go no further. Stargic grinned and came on. Ivan bit his lip. The monster was inches away from him. As Stargic stooped for the final lunge, the boy whipped off his mitten and flung the ice pips into the evil face. His voice echoed shrill through the cavern. Brothers nevermore shall part. Melt the winter in his heart. At once there came a rumbling sound, and the cavern floor quivered. Stargic staggered back with an awful cry, his hands clawing at his face. Ivan was flung to the floor. Behind him, the ice prison heaved, split and shivered into fragments. Ivan scrambled to his feet and backed off, eyeing the old man warily. Stargic made no attempt to follow, but stood, gazing at him across the shattered ice. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Stargic was smiling. There was no cruelty now in his smile. Ivan took a step forward. Something grabbed at his waist and clung there very tightly. He looked down and saw his brother's head pressed against him. All around, children were awakening, rubbing their eyes and gazing about them. You ought to be going, Stargic said. There is no wind now. You have a long journey. You will never see me again. But I shall see you. And when winter comes again, you will have reason to remember how Stargic's heart was warmed. And so they left Stargic's land, and Ivan took them home. And at every village he strode along the street crying, Here are your children, home again from far away. And the people cheered and brought food and heaped gifts upon them, and stood waving as the line of children marched away. With each village the line became a little shorter, until at last only Ivan and his brother were left. And so they came home, and the fear melted in the hearts of the people, and they were happy. And when winter came again, Stargic remembered his promise. No one heard him come, for the howling wolves were gone, and his sled was pulled now by silent deer. But when the people woke at dawn, there were sled tracks in the snow, and shining gifts by all the children's bed.